Okay, then we're going to start with you directly, Eric. Here talking about digital transformation. Tell us about your background.
Well, I'm an IT techie kind of guy for most of my career. I started back as an MCSE back in the Windows 2000 days. Actually, I started date myself a little bit. I started my exams with NT4, Windows NT4. So I've been around IT for a long time with it. Now, I've done roles that are help desk and training and system admin, and worked my way up through network architect roles and did data center consolidation projects. Eventually, I started specializing in SharePoint just because I liked it, um, and started doing really all of my work there, whether it was at the admin level or doing upgrade and migration projects or no code development. Um, I eventually became an MCSD as well, so I've got some actual code development things that I've done as well. I'm a Scrum Master and an IT team lead. I've been lots of those roles, and really I think that's relevant because when you're talking about digital transformation and user adoption, so much of it has to do with that changing behavior. And I think from the experience I've had, I've got some pretty good perspective on what maybe we have to change on the technical side in order to make this happen. And I've had some pretty eye-opening experiences with a couple of places I've worked.
Eric, there was a question out there saying that are we supposed to be seeing a blank screen? I don't know if you had
Oh yeah,
a.
it's just blank. We've got a couple of pictures we may pull up at different points in here to show stuff, but it's just blank at the moment. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. So let's talk about something specific over here. We love specificity, right? So
Sure.
you had experience at Philips Healthcare, right? And that
hmm
you told me has changed your perspective. How so?
Yeah, when I worked at Philips, I got hired as a developer, which is different. That was outside of the IT organization. I was working for a team that managed the software dev process for one particular software line that Philips worked with. I was a site owner for them and building a system to track that dev process, things that went with it. So there were forms and there were lists and there were workflows and stuff like that. And they really needed somebody that could kind of architect something using all those no code tools. So it was a very interesting assignment for me, a very interesting corporate position to be in, but it was very different. All the places I'd worked before, whether it was Wyndham Worldwide or Wiley Labs and NASA Space Medicine, Rolls-Royce, American College of Sports Medicine, all these different places, I was firmly footed in the IT organization. So that was always my perspective before. I believed in things like least privilege, support tiers, having service level agreements and promoting customizations through dev environments up through test and pre-prod and prod. And, help was either support or it was training for these things. So yeah, I come from that kind of an IT background, and then to go and work in that role that I had at Philips was very different. Um, I was not part of the IT organization. I didn't have the same access to the type of materials and the tools that they had, or even to the team itself. Philips is a very large organization, and that was one of the challenges that we worked with, is just having access to all this information and people and contacts and things from the IT organization. When you were just working on the business side, it was just a far different experience for me, and it really caused me to change my perspective and quite a bit. It was a good experience to work on that other side of the divide.
Okay. Well, did you have any specific problems that were posed over there? How did you
Yeah,
deal
there
with it?
were.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them were predictable things. Like for instance, not being in IT, I had limited permissions. So the governance policy there was that we wouldn't have any site collection administrator permissions as a site owner, which wasn't the end of the world. I'd advocated for that policy before, and I could work with that. The challenge was if there was something we needed in there, there was nobody to talk to, nobody that did have that I could reach out to and ask for help with something. Because being a SharePoint guy, as I had been for many years, there was time to time where I would want something that was at the site collection admin level that I need somebody to turn on for me or somebody to configure. There was also nobody to ask about governance or to easily ask. The policies weren't published anywhere prominently. The people that were on the support team were several time zones away. And being in a different part of the organization, it just was not at all easy to find someone to talk to about it. I eventually did get a contact who probably regretted that he had a contact because I kept asking him for stuff all the time once I had somebody to talk to, because it was a frustrating process before that. The other thing that was interesting there is some of the limitations that they had on the site that the team I was working with, the site they owned, were really difficult. Like, for instance, not only did we not have site collection admin, but we couldn't use SharePoint Designer, which means I couldn't make workflows. We had lots of limitations in there that in some situations make a lot of sense. But the challenge was there wasn't any clear direction on how do we get access to things like that. It turns out there was a separate SharePoint environment where they had workflow tools. In fact, it was Nintex workflow. It was my first exposure to that at the time. And eventually we did find that out, and we got our site put over there so that we could do some things, but every step along the way was hard. There wasn't clear information or clear direction or clear policy or clearly someone to ask about things. So a lot of it was just feeling through it by Braille. And then even when we got Nintex, there wasn't any real help available for how to use that tool with it. So it was just a lot of Braille, and that was difficult. There also, if there were performance problems on the farm or outages or anything, all I could do was create a support ticket. And then it goes off into the void of support. If any of you guys that are listening are part of a large organization, you probably experienced that at some point, right? It's a large organization. It's hard knowing who got the ticket, where it's at, and what's happening sometimes about it. And that was definitely the case there. That was one challenge, was just being outside of it. It was kind of like, most of us have been to the DMV probably, right? It kind of felt like that. It was lots of things where there wasn't much of a, it was indecipherable forms in the ticket queue. I'm trying to pull up a picture here, and it's not coming up for whatever reason.
Oh.
Anyway, most of us can connect with what the DMV is like, right? You got these long indecipherable forms to fill out. You really don't know what's the reason these questions are being asked, what it's for, what you're supposed to put in there. There's nobody to ask questions of until you get up to the end of the counter. Long queue to wait through. You get up to the end, and then they tell you did it wrong and you got to start over. That's kind of what it felt like. And it kind of made me wonder at the time how many times I'd done that in the past working in an IT organization, because it's a very different perspective when you're outside of IT looking at something like a ticketing system. It's a very different perspective for it. And it's interesting, Philips overall was a pretty innovative company. They have some very smart people working there, some very innovative things they do with technology. And it's just that this particular tool that we were working with, SharePoint, in that environment had very complicated governance and rules and boundaries. And it at least looked like, from the outside looking in, like a lot of those best practices and things and rules and boundaries had come from other platforms. Something like Exchange or SQL, something that was less improvisational. And more cut and dried, with end user use cases. So anyway, those were some of the challenges that we had. It was a painful experience, especially for someone that had always been in kind of the driver's seat for those types of IT organizational type decisions.
Yeah, definitely can relate to many of these things myself. Folks out there, actually, it would be great to know also if you're in a mid-sized organization, large-sized organization, what kind of organization you're in, and the challenges you're experiencing, and if anything that resonates with you with what Eric is saying. And Eric is going to fix some of the visuals that he has. Actually, there's some difficulty here. I'll show you some stuff as well. But honestly, this, as I mentioned before, this session is very much about you. So please come out and talk about what you have in mind as well. Any specific questions? So one thing that I was thinking about as Eric was describing all these things is this sounds pretty painful. as to what you had to go through. And it is painful in large organizations. Every time that I've consulted or trained in organizations, I've seen a huge difference by doing it in big ones compared to the small ones, of how much red tape and things that you have to go through which are not necessary, unfortunately. So did that have any effect on you, Eric, specifically all that pain that you had to go through?
It did. Yeah. And again, in a lot of cases, I could understand the motivations behind all these decisions, all these policies and boundaries and limitations and things like that. I'd been in IT for 15 years at that point. So I understood where they were coming from. I understood what kind of standard best practice checkboxes had been checked and things like that. But from the business side, I could also see how many of the things that were done missed the point. Um, they were done because it's just the way we've always done things, rather than looking at, we have this tool, how can we do things in a way that actually lets people use the tool, that actually lets people do what it's supposed to do. And there's a middle ground to be found there. Where it's at in every organization is different, but it's but it really helped me to understand that a lot of those things that we just fall back on are instincts in IT from lessons we've learned from problems that have had somewhere along the line. That those can make actually adopting SharePoint incredibly painful. That was my case. I was a SharePoint fanboy, and it made it very difficult for me to adopt it, even though I was very motivated to do so. I started off with frustration about it, and then it eventually went to introspection. Is that what it was like trying to work in my environments that I'd managed before? It was kind of a real eye opener or a philosophical turning point for me.
Yeah.
And I had to start thinking about what would make more sense if an organization actually wanted people to use this platform. What would still allow some control, would still allow some standardization, still try to keep things from becoming the Wild West, but would still allow people to actually use the platform the way it was intended. How could I adapt things to make things simpler, not just for IT, but for the users that we're working? How could I work within these lessons that we've learned from all this time in IT, but still advocate for the other side of the fence, the end user and the power user? Because that's really what it boils down to.
It does.
You got to think about the people that ultimately have to use this tool that we're rolling out and that we're building policies and rules around. And we have to think about what solves it for them. And that's really where I came to from a philosophical standpoint, is that you always have to advocate for the end user and the power user. It doesn't mean you have no rules, but it means that you try to make rules that actually make sense for them, right? That make their life simpler and make it so that they can use the platform and they can, because a tool like SharePoint is kind of improvisational, right? Most people only do document management in it, but there's so much you can do there to solve your own requirements, solve your own problems, in whatever business use case you've got. But boy, we can sure cut the legs out from under that by the policies and the procedures we put in place around things. So that's where it got to me. That's where the point it got me to, metaphorically.
I'm going to share a story as well about something that happened with me with a large organization and the governance that they were trying to put into place. And Eric, by the way, I don't know if you got your slides ready. You might want to see if you can. Still white screen. Still white screen on that.
That is really weird. That is really weird, because this worked right before the presentation, right before the webinar started.
So let me share a quick story with you guys on this one as well. Governance, that word itself is such an elusive word, such a weird and vague term, to be honest. I think everybody wants it, but not many people know what it is, so what to do with it. And I've seen too many organizations out there who make a governance document, or sometimes a very, very large governance document. And they have governance committees, steering committee and all, which meets and eats and does stuff, but not many people care about it. So in this particular story, it's a short story. What happened one day, I was speaking at one of the conferences actually, and at this conference, a person came up to me after the conference session asking, "Hey, Asif, I got this big problem. You talk about governance in your session, and we have spent so much money on making a governance document and making governance guidelines and all, and no one is paying attention to it. No one is actually reading it or following the governance guidelines and policies we put into place. such as don't make a subsite if all you need is a page, or don't use these file names and do this. It's something simple like that, and some more broad things as well, right? Uh,
Yeah.
the next thing would happen. It really surprised me. So I asked the guy, I would be more than happy to look at your governance document, check it out, and see if I can offer any guidance or any thoughts on it. Can I see it? Would you mind showing it to me? And the person said, I kid you not, is well, let me go find it. I'll get back to you. I have to actually find it.
Yeah.
Like, come on, if you don't know where it is, how can you expect others to know where it is? And
Right.
even if
It
they
gets
knew
back to
where it
that.
is, yeah, even if they knew where it is, why would they care about going there unless it's something in it for them? There's got to be that why. There's got to be that something in it. What's in it for them? The with him, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I think these are logical things the way I think about it. Maybe it's just me, but if you care, that's great for you, and you've spent all this money doing it, or your company has. But if you can't relate that to the people that you want to provide these policies to, they will not care, no matter how much you care about it, how much money you've spent on it. That's just the reality.
Yeah. It's very true. I mean, it gets back to that DMV metaphor, right? It's the
Oh,
same
look at
thing. You
that! I
got
see
all
a
these,
slide.
yeah, you got all these complicated rules and laws and regulations in the background that nobody in line understands, right? All we know is we're stuck here and the line's not moving. Right? I can't do what I need to do um, because of all that. So it's, yeah, you've got to get out of that kind of default perspective we have of these official policies that we store as a 127-page PDF somewhere and just expect the people will understand what's there. That first of all, they'll even know there is one, um, that they can find it, and that they would care enough to read through all of that to find it out. You've got to find a way to, again, to advocate for the end user, and it's in the decisions you make that are in the policy, but it's also in how you publish that information to it. That's one of the big lessons I learned from there, from Phillips, was how important that is. Because it's something on all my previous positions, I'd had access to all that stuff. In fact, I'd been part of writing those policies, so I knew what they were. I knew what the answers were, right? Um, but it's really important to put that information out somewhere that it's easily findable and easily digestible for it. So it's one of the lessons I took with me to my next stop. Um,
Oh, you shared a next stop. Let's talk about that. What is your
yeah.
next stop?
Well, I got recruited by Visa, the credit card company, from there, and I went and I was a solutions engineer. It was part of the SharePoint team, so I was back in the IT organization, but still doing that kind of no code development work, and they wanted a lot more user adoption or digital transformation type activities from me. So, excuse me. So we did coaching, and we did no code build work, and we did training classes, and we did all kinds of stuff, but it was all trying to focus on getting more information, or excuse me, getting more adoption of the SharePoint platform in the company. So I was excited about that because I kind of seen the playbook I did not want to use, from my previous stop. So it was a good opportunity for me, not just to leave the pain from where I was working, but also to go somewhere where I was empowered to make a difference, and to focus on actual real life adoption for the organization. And I really enjoyed that opportunity to do it. So,
It's good
I
to
got to
know.
Visa. They had some challenges. Um, So I kind of list some of those here. These aren't really the challenges, but they kind of paint the picture. We had a couple of SharePoint on-prem farms in different versions. The main one people were using at the time was 2010. There was a migration that had started for 2013. There were only about 350 site collections and only about 100 people that were site owners. So you think about an organization the size of Visa, it was about 20,000 users at the time. That's a really small SharePoint implementation for that size of a company. And really the users, as you talk to them, they were very unmotivated about SharePoint. That sound familiar to anybody out there? Probably. Most of the sites were just document management, and people were only using that when they had to. Kind of what we had there. I've seen that lots of places, but we saw that when I first got there at Visa, and to Visa's credit, they were interested in changing that equation. So from that, we had fairly low adoption. We didn't have a power user group or a community of any kind. Of course, there were some people that did some power user things, but there wasn't very much of that, and it was all very disconnected. The end users really only did document management if they did anything at all. Kind of like you were mentioning, the governance policies were written by the techies, and they were really only accessible by the techies. Technically, they did exist in a place people could get to them, but nobody would know they were there unless they were looking specifically for it. There was also a competing platform at Visa. I don't know if any of you guys faced that in your organizations, but we had, there was Confluence. So there was a wiki product, and there was Jira for task management and some of the collaboration on agile projects and things. There was a few other pieces of that, but there were a lot of users that really didn't know which platform to use for what, and it got down to really to personal preference. In a lot of cases, they were managed by different teams and had different policies and things about them, and it was a point of confusion for users about what do we do. There's quite a bit of overlap between a use case I could do in either one of these. We also didn't have a lot of go-to destinations in SharePoint at the time. We didn't have any of those highly visible solutions that have been built in SharePoint, so they were basically for teams. A team needed to collaborate, and most of the time it was just storing documents. So people really didn't know what SharePoint could do because they had no examples to look at. They had no wins that they could see. We also had a shortage of manpower on the SharePoint team. That's probably familiar to everybody on the call, because that's pretty much every IT department I've ever worked at. There's more work than there are people, which made it a challenge for you to do any kind of outreach to the users, because there was always a fire burning, always something that needed to be built. And as a result, the help that was offered was pretty standard IT fare. We had support tickets. If something's broken or something's wrong, fill out a support ticket. And if you want to learn something, if you want to grow, then we have an LMS system somewhere, and there's some SharePoint stuff in there you could go see. Nothing wrong with those things. Those are perfectly fine resources to have, but that was the situation. And really, I could tell from the experience I'd just been through that a lot of these were part of the reason why adoption was low, is because of the way we were doing things. So, I was empowered by management in IT, and specifically over that collaborative technologies team, to make some changes in how we did things. And we found some things that made a big difference. For instance, we had to change our behavior a little bit. That's from the title of our webinar, right? It's change our behavior before we expect the users to change theirs. So we got down to what we called a strategic concept of strategic simplicity. We use kind of Captain Caveman as our mascot. The idea is, a lot of times our tendency in IT was to build something that was way more complicated than it needed to be, because we'd been paid for years to be thinking ahead of what problems were likely to come up and try to be solving those before they happen. And there's value in that, but sometimes it means we build something that's just way overcomplicated for what we need. And and that's true from solutions we build, but also from policies we create and the way we offer support and things like that. We do things that make sense to us, but they wind up being this big complicated thing for the end users to deal with. An example would be ticketing, right? Somebody needed a new SharePoint site. Well, we didn't have very many of those, and not very many people were asking for them, okay? But if they did, it was in the ticketing system, and it was a long, complicated form with acronyms and lots of blanks to fill out, and most people that weren't in IT didn't understand half the things that were in the form. They made perfect sense to us in the SharePoint team because we knew why all those things were important. The end users didn't. They didn't know any of that. So we decided to make things a bit simpler for that. We just created a very simple form in SharePoint using InfoPath at the time. That was a site request form. And then we had a workflow in it that when someone filled it out, it notified us. And actually, I even took that on myself, just said, notify me about it. And if there's something in here that clearly there's some questions that need to be asked, I can follow up with them. That way, I can, with a quick call or an email, I can probably find out, I can clarify something, and then we can give it to the admin guys that are going to go through the provisioning and do that. In most cases, it was very simple. Most people didn't have complicated requests. What they wanted was a default team site someplace where they could do something in it, right? It was, most of the time, those requests were really simple. So that was one thing we did with it, but we kept looking for those opportunities. Where can we simplify things? Not just simplify for IT, but simplify for the users too. Governance was one of those. We went through and reviewed all the governance we had, and we asked ourselves the hard questions. Why? Do we really need that? Is it making life simpler, or is it making it harder? In a lot of cases, something that we'd put in here made sense a few years ago when we created the policy for it, but it really didn't matter much anymore. Things had changed to the point. Give you an example that came for us later. We looked at that again every time we made a migration or an upgrade. We would look at our governance again. Do those rules still make sense in the new world we're creating here? An example is something like site quotas. Those make perfect sense when you're in an on-prem farm. In a lot of cases, you may find they make less sense when you're in the cloud. Storage is pretty cheap there, and you've got a lot of it. So, should that be a defining element in how people use your sites? Whereas we had a real tight quota for things that were on-prem because we had disaster recovery concerns and storage space limitations and all sorts of things. So you just start reviewing that stuff, and is this making life simpler, or is it making it harder? So like in the example of site quotas, once we got to a point where it really didn't matter as much to us anymore how big a site got, we started realizing that was making life harder, because you had somebody that had more than a couple of gigs of space or whatever quota they had. Well, now they had to divide everything up among 2 or 3 team sites, and now there was no clear way to know what was in each one. So you wind up in these complicated navigation things where they try to make navigation bars that go back and forth. It just made life hard. So we were willing to change those things, even though up to now it had always been the way we'd done things. There's also kind of a philosophical goal too, that the purpose of having the platform was for people to actually use it. So we started leaning more toward the idea of best practices, and adoption goals, use cases that we thought were productive for people. We started leaning toward those instead of toward rules that locked everything down on the server. As an example of that, the site request we talked about before used to be really detailed and specific, and we found that most people didn't care or understand all those things. So we just came up with a default collaboration unit. Somebody makes a request, this is what we're going to give them unless they ask us for something specific, right? That doesn't mean that they could only have a standard team site. If there was some other site template they wanted to use for something, they could, but there's no reason for us to ask everybody that every time they were going in to fill out a site request. 90% of them was just this one thing. So if we simplify the rule, the form, we can also simplify the rule. We're not going to dictate what you have to have as your site template, but you're going to have to request and have a reason for it to use something else for it. And that worked really well. Just that little bit of simplification and flexibility made a big difference with people requesting sites and getting them.
There's a question out there by Sybil. Is asking, we talked about ticketing before, and you mentioned it's often quite frustrating, as you mentioned, that people don't know who's on the other side, and almost feels like a barrier.
Yeah.
At least for me, he said. And is there a way to do it differently? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There are, and we went about it very differently. We didn't get rid of tickets. There are some things that it really makes sense for. There are some things that are standardized requests, or it's a system of record. There's lots of reasons corporations use a ticketing system. They're not evil in themselves. The problem is when you use them for absolutely everything, and you make somebody go through this arbitrary process that's too complicated, it becomes a barrier to entry for it. So we kept tickets at Visa, but we didn't make people do that every time they had a question about something. We came up with other ways to give them, instead of calling it support, we started calling it help. just calling it a different word made a big difference in the perspective on it, because support is this, from an IT perspective, is this very structured thing that probably involves tickets and queues and teams assigned to queues and different tier levels and all that kind of stuff. Whereas help, that's, I have a problem, I need somebody to help me either fix it or answer and tell me what I'm doing wrong, right? With it. So One of the things we did that had one of the biggest effects is we started scheduling a weekly office hours session. Excuse me. We did it once a week. We did it around lunchtime, um, so that it was less likely to be during a time when somebody had a meeting going on. And we just put somebody from our team in a conference room and on a Skype bridge. And then we started evangelizing that. Through the week when people would email us or call us and ask us something, our default answer there was, that's a great question. Would you mind coming to our office hours event tomorrow? And then we can just talk about it live. I think probably in 10 minutes we can solve that instead of spending 2 or 3 days going back and forth over email. Okay? Users loved it. They absolutely loved it. And for us, nobody likes to put another meeting on your calendar. So it was hard to get buy-ins from a couple of people on the team until we started trying it. But what we discovered is we wound up having a lot fewer calls with people because our users loved knowing that there was this time they could come every week and they could just ask questions. They could do that. So we got a lot fewer interruptions during the week. We got more done, and the users felt like it was more tactile for them, right? It was something where it was less abstract. They didn't have to go through this invisible queuing system and not have any idea where their ticket went and wait until the end of the service level agreement when someone had to answer the ticket and then they would tell us that it was wrong. We just stopped doing that for all those. We still use tickets for what it made sense for. But by doing this, we found that users were very content to write their questions down on a Post-it note through the week, and then they would come talk to us in office hours. And again, 10 minutes talking with somebody, we could fix something for them or satisfy their curiosity or show them how they were doing it the hard way. Right? And that made a huge difference. All of a sudden, we had all kinds of people that, we made the site request process simpler. And now we've done this thing that was kind of an outreach, kind of put a human face on the platform and on the support around the platform. And they loved it. We started getting all kinds of people asking for sites because, okay, that makes sense. I understand that now. Now I would like to use that for my team to do that. And it became the tool that people wanted to use, even though it was the exact same platform that we had before, right? But they wanted to use it because it was easy for them to see how to get help. It was easy
Absolutely.
for them to grow a little bit and to be more productive with it instead of just struggling and hitting their head against the wall for a while. So it was easier for them and it was easier for us too. One thing that surprised me about it, I thought we were going to have scaling problems with that, and that we'd wind up with a long line of people waiting. It was only an hour every week that we were doing it. And we did start getting a line of people, but we never once had anybody complain. They would sit there on the Skype bridge and they would listen to the questions other people were asking and the answers those people got. Okay? And they were perfectly happy to wait their turn because they're learning the whole time. They never thought to ask that question, right? So it was really quite a success story for that.
Very cool. Here's another question I'm going to ask that as well before I ask other questions in my own head. What about chat? No, this is of course not what you did before years ago because this is all fairly new stuff. But what about chatbots or other instant help things like maybe even having a hotline, things like that? Does that make things easier?
I do think anything you can do to cause less abstraction, for the end users and power users are ones that want to be power users. Anything you can do to lower that barrier to entry. I think chatbots can be part of that. The thing about them in a lot of cases, I think chatbot is one way to go about it. I think another is using a system like Visual SP, right? A contextual help system. The idea is giving help in small chunks so that people don't have to go search trying to find it, making it so it's readily available to them in some way. Like office hours was a human way to help them find the help, right? At Visa, we also had Visual SP. That's where I first came in contact with it. Used it, and we would use Visual SP as a way to kind of spoon feed some of this help information. Some of it was out of the box, some of it was custom stuff we created to do that. And I found it was really helpful because the idea is you want to make it easy for people to find. The more effort they have to put forth into finding it, the less likely they are to do it. Okay? And you also need to make it small, bite-sized. We've got a bunch of the Microsoft adoption specialists that you see here at conferences and things. We'll talk about that. One of them uses the word snackable, right? You give somebody a long page to go read, it's from TechNet or something. I mean, that's great if you're from IT and you've got that level of interest and all that, but most people on the business side of things don't have that level of interest. I'm just looking for how do I do this one thing? Yeah, this one thing that's stopping me from accomplishing what I need to accomplish. So whether you do that with a chatbot that can return, that can access a store of information that way, or whether you do that through a contextual system that's showing things that are relevant to what the person's working on currently. I think those are both very valid ways to do it, but I think you need something like that. I'm a big fan of having a SharePoint help site in your network somewhere where you put things that are where people want to dig a little more. But I think that most end users don't have the level of interest, the attention span, or the luxury of time to be able to go do that.
Yeah, it's like going on the internet and just doing a search. It's
It is.
not the same
I
thing,
mean,
but you're on the intranet hoping to find it.
it is. It's much that way. And most people, if you do have stuff in your internet that way, most of them don't know where it is, so they go to Google anyway, right?
Yeah.
And you can learn anything on Google and YouTube, right? But sometimes you got to spend a lot of time to do it. Like with a SharePoint question, you got your question, you type, well, first of all, you may not be calling it exactly the right thing. So you may have to do a few tries before you finally come across the right stuff. And then you got to figure out the person that's writing it. First of all, do they know what they were doing? Second of all, were they using the same version I'm using? And thirdly, is what they're describing something I'm allowed to do in my environment? You can learn it, but it's hard.
Yeah. Honestly, I even wonder, well, actually, I know for a fact, many times I talk to users, they don't even know they're using SharePoint. It's just, this is our intranet. This is what it is. So they won't be
Yeah.
looking for SharePoint functionality. They'll just be looking for what they're struggling with, which is a business solution that was built on top of their intranet or in their portal, which just
Right.
happens to be running using SharePoint. So when you have these many layers of, all right, I don't know. I'm just looking to see how I can do this XYZ thing, which is maybe an expense reimbursement form that I need to fill out in this library. That's all I know. How do I go searching for that? Who do I ask for help? That's when people
Yeah.
get frustrated. They don't know what to search for, where to search for it, who to ask, and then just give up on it or just ask somebody else to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a certain subset of users that will always want to ask somebody instead of do it self-serve. But a lot of the people I've worked with over the years are smart people, and they would rather not feel stupid. So they would
Agree.
rather not go bug somebody to ask if there was some easy way for them to find an answer on their own. The problem is most of the time there's not. For years and years and years, Microsoft has had lots of good how-to help type information. The
Hmm.
problem was you only ever found it accidentally.
Yeah.
If you actually needed an answer right now, it was incredibly difficult. That's why nobody for years clicks on the question mark button in Word or Excel, because it's so hard to find what you're looking for. You forget it's even there because
Findability. Yeah.
it's so you've got to find some way it's a radical idea, but to actually be helpful to your users. And that's something a lot of times, what I found in myself and in the experience I'd had in IT before, that part was less than it should be. It's we're expecting people at the end user level or the power user level to care enough about the tool to be willing to go do the research and to find something and do it. And most of the time the HR person wasn't hired to become a SharePoint person. They were hired to do HR things.
Hmm.
Right? So they only care about SharePoint and usually enough to accomplish what they need to accomplish. So you got to find some way to actually be helpful to that. And some of that is the human way, things like office hours and little brief webinars that you record and make available for them later. It's having a contextual help system that doesn't show you all the available help that's anything about SharePoint. It shows you the things that are relevant to what you're working on right now. That makes a huge difference, being able to do that. And then putting in there things that your users are asking. It's because of some specific use case that's common where you are, or it's a governance policy you have that people ask you about all the time. Putting those answers in there and then starting to steer people toward it. Once people have one or two good experiences with a self-serve help solution, many of them will try to go use it again. The problem is most people have had bad experiences with help solutions along the way, whether it's Google or something else we give them, a help site or something. So something like a chatbot has a lot of potential. I'm not aware of any out there that I think are terribly effective at the moment for this exact use case. Um, contextual help is one that I know real well, obviously. Uh,
Yeah.
but I think it's important that you do something like that. You've got to find a way to take away the abstract and take away the searching from people so that they've got a good chance in 1 or 2 clicks of finding an answer to what they need to do.
It'd be good if folks out there, if you have a specific way that you're currently doing it, currently providing training, help, whatever you call it, to your users, if you can share some of your thoughts here as well. And we'll make that, I'll repeat some of these things here and we'll make it public later. I mean, not with your name, we just, we'll put it out there later as well for others.
Yeah, it would be
Just
interesting to
good to
hear.
know what you're doing. Yeah.
In general, I hear far fewer people saying their company does internal training programs anymore. Used to be there were a lot of them,
Hmm.
and I find that far fewer now.
Yeah.
Um, and I think a lot of it I've heard you say at conferences a lot before, Asif, is it doesn't work. Training your end users doesn't work. And a lot of times that's true. We found that at Visa when I was there too. I started off, I've been a trainer for years. I love going to training. I love giving training, all those kind of things. But what we found is even if I did just a half-day class internally and it cost nothing, sometimes it was still hard to get people in it.
Yeah.
Because I have to be away from my desk and my actual work for a half a day to do this. And then you also needed that much attention span from them. They were interested enough to spend a half a day talking about this. It was hard. It did help. And I think we made some progress with it. But what we found is that smaller, shorter form training stuff worked a lot better. We did something, there was an internal learning organization at Visa called Visa University. And we started partnering with them, and we made what we started off thinking it would be SharePoint summer school, but then we thought nobody wants to go to summer school, so we called it summer camp instead. But it was a thing where we just made 4 short sessions during the day that were not dependent on each other. So you'd have one for SharePoint 101 stuff, you'd have another 1 or 2 for power user things, and maybe 1 for site owners somewhere. But you make these little 45-minute sessions. It was heavy on demo. Not really hardly any slides to it. And then a question and answer session at the end. Ask me about what we just did or anything else that's on your mind, right? And those were really popular. People would come and do just one of those, or some people would come and spend the whole day because they were interested enough. But a lot of people would just do one of those, or they would want to watch the recording later for it. So we started, publishing those internally, and that was successful too. We started getting a lot more traction, a lot more people that would pay attention to an arrangement like that than to scheduling half-day training classes somewhere. There's that idea of trying to make it accessible. Again, trying to make it simpler and more relevant for people. Focus on some use case. That was another thing. The webinar that we did, it couldn't be about use SharePoint publishing feature. Nobody cared about the publishing feature. But you could say, how do I make a better homepage for my team site? That was a use case that some site owners cared about, right? So you would do that. You would pick some use case that was important, and we would talk about what's the business pain point that you're doing, and then how do we use these things in SharePoint to solve that pretty easily. And those were popular. Those we get people that would come and do.
So, here's something that I'm sure people out there thinking about it, I always think about it, is you got your regular job, and then you got your quote unquote adoption activities that you also need to do to get people interested in what you are putting out, or your team is putting out. How do you balance all that stuff out? How do you keep focus on adoption activities and still do other stuff?
That's the question right there, because that's another thing we learned at Visa is you can have all these wonderful intentions, but if you can't stay focused on things, or if you lose track of those, you lose ground on it. And it's really true. What you have to start doing is everything you're doing, that you would have been doing anyway, regardless before, you start doing it through the lens of how do I help my users benefit from this? So you still got, you've got support tickets that come in. If you're the admin guy, you've probably got support tickets coming in where something's broken. Well, the changes that I'm going to make to either try and stop this, I have to stop and think about my end users. right? And not just think about making the ticket stop. But how do I solve this in a problem that also makes their life easier, right? That allows them to use the tool and hopefully in some way also simplifies my life as well. A lot of times the extra things that we do to control things actually mean more work for us and more work for the user at the end of the day. So what we did is we kind of had 4 questions or 4 different areas. I call them the caveman tenets to user adoption. And no matter what we were doing, we always thought about this idea of strategic simplicity. What would the caveman do, right, for this? And went back to that. So it's more a mindset change, and a philosophical change to the things that you have to do anyway as an admin team. So we talked about anytime we did something with governance, we made sure that it, first of all, passed the common sense test, and that we could explain what is the rule. We could explain it simply in plain English. And we could also give, at least one good reason why that was there, why that rule was a good thing. That helped a lot, because when you're telling somebody, if you just tell them no and there's no answer as to why or what else could they do instead, or how can I still be successful within this, then now it's just hitting their head on the ceiling. But if you give a little thought to just that simple idea, does it pass common sense for the user, and can I explain it to them? Right? Then you can advocate for it, and you can say, yeah, you can't do exactly that, like workflow, for instance. Yeah, you can't have SharePoint Designer, and there's some good reasons for that, right? But if you need to do workflows, we've got this other tool, Nintex. It's actually better. It's easier to use, it's safer, and it's more powerful. So let me show you how to do that instead. So it's really that mindset, that philosophical change. For that, governance is one of those. Another is having some way to measure what you're doing. So when you're making changes, like maybe it's the site request I was talking about earlier that we did at Visa, well, you got to have some way to measure the changes you're making. So one of the real simple things we measured to track our adoption was how many site collections we have, because we were letting people request them. So the more we had, the more interest there was in the platform. Most people would start using somebody else's site, and if they cared enough, they would ask for their own site to use for some other purpose somewhere. So that was one thing we started measuring. What kind of requests are we getting? What is our site count? You take snapshots of that over the time. You can make a really nice, easy to read graph for people. Showed it. Another thing related to that was how many users were making those requests. How many unique site owners are there? Those are really key, very simple metrics to track. They went along with the work we were doing anyway, but they allowed us to measure how we're doing. So it's just everything you do, you start thinking about digital transformation, user adoption. You start thinking about those things, and either how does this help that cause, or how do I measure it so I can see whether it's helping or hurting. So it's, in reality, it shouldn't be adding a lot more work for you to do the types of things we're talking about here. I mean, if you have a true blue digital adoption program, where you're doing tip campaigns and desk drops and there's lots of activities. There's a whole industry that's built around this, and they're wonderful, they're great, but you can do a lot with user adoption just by changing that mindset and making sure every decision you make, you're talking about strategic simplicity. Okay? Am I making life harder or easier for the users? And how do I lower that barrier to entry for them and encourage them to use it? How do you become the platform people want to use instead of the one that's a pain? That's the key. Did I answer the question? I don't know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely, I can resonate with that quite a bit.
Yeah.
So lastly over here, if you could tell everybody what you're up to now.
Oh, sure. Well, I work for Visual SP now. I came here and I do the services lead. So a lot of these things, these lessons that I've learned the hard way over the years, I'm trying to help organizations learn them an easier way to do that. So there's lots of ways to do that. One of the things that we found the most popular with organizations is you can just buy a bucket of one-on-one consulting hours, and me or somebody like me can just jump in with you and identify what is the thing you're trying to solve and how can we do that. So sometimes it's creating custom help items that go in. Sometimes it's deployment stuff. I've got one organization, it's one of the med centers for the Veterans Affairs Administration. that had a form and workflow project that they knew they had the tools for it, and they had some people that were already in the right technical area to know this kind of stuff, but they didn't know how to connect all the dots. So we're helping them to adopt SharePoint better by helping their techies build one of these things in no code, so that they not only have the solution when they're done, but they also know how to do it. They can use those same skills to tackle other things that they have going similarly. And that'll help them a lot, not just their tech team. The one that we're building for them is highly visible. All the employees in their med center are going to have to use this tool. So they're all going to see one that makes their life simpler, makes it easier. And that in turn means a lot of those people will start to imagine that maybe SharePoint could help them with their business problem as well. That's one of the things we learned at Visa too. You get some examples out there of some solutions that are either super easy or they're at least less painful than they were before. If you can build those in SharePoint, then it helps to create momentum. Do those things. So that's the kind of stuff we're doing now. We're helping other people with that too. It's almost like buying yourself a gift card, right? In fact, we've got that graphic on the web page on our website. You just buy some hours and we use them in whatever way is helpful.
Yeah, and the beauty of the whole thing, as you were already saying, is that you can use the hours as you need it, right? It's more, it's not a project, it's more of a hourly purchase. So
Yeah.
if you need Eric's help or somebody from Eric's team, reach out to us, let us know. visualsp.com is where you want to go and check it out to see what's available. Yeah, so many of these problems are very similar across organizations, across industries even. So if we can share our knowledge and share what we have done to be able to help you, definitely let us know on that. Any last words of any last words of wisdom or anything you want to share with everybody?
I would say that strategic simplicity, and you don't have to have a full-blown user adoption program to benefit from these ideas. It's taking the things that you're already doing and just looking at them through that lens of how do I make life simpler? How do I make the tool more valuable, more easier to use? And how do I reach out to my users? Because things like that office hours idea do both. They not only help your users, they help you. You get fewer interruptions during the day. So look for those opportunities, and think of strategic simplicity. And actually, that's the same idea with our gift card thing. How do we make it as easy as possible for you to get help somewhere? You don't have to go through and scope out a project and make it 6 figures and a team of developers and all that. A lot of times you just need to get started, make some small moves that go in the right direction. Happy to help with that.
Yeah. Well, we're done a few minutes early over here. Folks have actually shared that obviously the regular kind of training that people do as expected is putting up a wiki site, putting up just SharePoint sites or something out there to do training. We're talking about that again. But that rarely works, unfortunately. Let us know if we can help with your needs in consulting services as well as product or just getting information out to your users. We'd be happy to help. We'll get done a couple of minutes early over here, looks like, but if you have any questions, reach out, info@visualsp.com or sales@visualsp.com or eric@visualsp.com.
Yeah.
Or Asif, myself, ASIF@visualsp.com. Let us know if we can help.